Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about farm management. So I'm going to come down one level from where Saul was. I have a client base that's primarily primary producers, but not all primary producers. We have business owners in our client base, some that are related to agriculture, some that aren't related at all. One of the things we do know is that agricultural production systems, agricultural businesses are more interesting and more complex to manage. And when you're trying to bring soils, people, plants, animals together and make them go where you want them to go, it's reasonably challenging. On top of that, you've got to do it in an environment that, as Saul described, you haven't got a lot of control over many aspects of. The culmination of that is that if these systems aren't well managed, they'll get out of control, incredibly hard to get back under control. Ultimately, they'll bite you really hard, and they'll bite you in a very, very tender place. And any primary producer can tell you that very tender place is in your back pocket. I want to talk about a couple of groups for the purposes of this discussion, and there's a fair chance you will have heard them before. I want to talk about the best and I want to talk about the average. And I want to introduce a different group, which is called the average with a star. So the average with a star doesn't include the top 10%. So I'll look at them as two distinct groups, two distinct samples. And average with a star, if it's the bottom 90%, and that's a nice way of different way of saying average with a star, it does include most people. Most primary producers are in that sample. I'll generally get through this presentation without offending too many people because the majority of people in the bottom 90% assume they're in the top 10% anyway. I think the best farmers, the best primary producers are those that are getting the system right and they're making it work. Those best farmers have businesses that are incredibly profitable, and for me as a farm business economist, I would say that that's a good measure of success. And those businesses, because of the complexity and the dynamic environment they're set in, have to be able to cope with shocks. All of those things that's all put up there means that there's going to be shocks hitting these businesses on an annual basis. In terms of how these systems should evolve, they actually should evolve out of just logical business decision making, and that's looking at efficiency measures, so things like return on capital, production per hectare, production per animal. Anything that's per something is a measure of efficiency. The other aspect of the business that we need to look at is net worth. So we want to see growth in net worth. We want to see the business be worth more at the end of the year than it was at the start of the year. We also need to consider liquidity or cash flow. It's no use making great economic decisions if the business can't cash flow them and goes broke in the process. And finally, we need to incorporate risk. So because these are risky businesses, we need to get a measure of how robust the businesses are. The process for doing that is benchmarking, and I'll be surprised if everyone in this room hasn't heard of benchmarking, but I want to run through what it is, and I want to clearly differentiate it from another process called comparative analysis. Comparative analysis covers off on the first 2 points up here, and then the other 3 points complete the benchmarking process. So when it comes to benchmarking, we have to identify areas that we want to improve, and they'll normally be called key performance indicators or critical success factors. And as industries, particularly primary industries, we are quite good at that. You can pick up material all over the place that says the best primary producers are doing this and the average are doing this, or the top quartile are doing this. Secondly, we need to find out what the top 5 to 10% are doing. And again, there's plenty of material around that will tell you and describe to you what the top 5 to 10% of primary producers are doing within their businesses, what practices they employ. The next 3 steps is generally where the benchmarking process starts to break down. So if we want to make a change and we want to move from where we are and incorporate best practice into our business, we actually have to understand that best practice. So we actually have to go to those other businesses and not just look at what they're doing, but how they're implementing it in their systems. So we don't tend to be great at that. We also find it difficult to adapt or adopt those practices back into our own businesses because the majority of people actually don't know their own business that well. So you've got to understand the practice in someone else's business. You've got to understand that your business is different, and every primary producer tells me that their farm or their business is different. So you've got to know both of those to be able to incorporate best practice. Then we've got to monitor and continuously improve. So most people get through the first bit and not a lot happens, so they get sick of monitoring, so they don't tend to be able to utilise a continuous improvement model. And we tend to be pretty hopeless at that. That is all that the top 5 to 10% of business owners do. That's their simple success model. So if I look at these primary production businesses and I try to get in behind some of those numbers, what I find is there's 5 basic things that I think these farming systems are based on. And the first one is that there's got to be a desire to farm for profit rather than just farm the way you want. Got to have an understanding of your resource base, recognise that it is different to other farms, and the suitability of the production system that you're employing. Got to have a really good understanding of business. You need to know what profit means, you need to know what risk is, and you absolutely need to understand the concept of marginal revenue and marginal cost so you can manage with in-season variations. Got to have an understanding of the production system in place and how that drives profits, because when shocks hit, you need to cut and shut. If you don't understand what's making all the money in your business, what's making the least amount of money at the margin, what to drop out and how hard to cut, you cannot run a profitable business year in, year out. And then the final point is there needs to be a really high level of skill associated with the key profit drivers. So when I look at a business, this is what I see. I see a return up the top to the capital and the management. And the M's been dropped off in the last 10 years or so because I think we're all a bit politically correct. But ultimately, the cost of capital in a farming business, in the majority of cases, is a function of its productive capacity. So then if I say, well, it is what it is, and it's expensive because of what it is, probably around rainfall and soil type and those sorts of things, that ultimately the return that you get on a set of assets is driven by management capability. So then I must naturally conclude from that either as a business manager, a farm business manager, you are either the ultimate driver of your business or the biggest limitation to your business. And in most cases, you're going to be the biggest limitation because you're in the bottom 80, 90%. And that's normally the conversation I have to have with any new client. And if I survive the conversation, then we get to go and do some exciting stuff and improve business performance. Under the return to capital, there's some key performance indicators. In most primary production businesses, there's 3 to 5 things that if you get right, the business will perform at a fairly high level. And you can cock up a whole heap of other things at the margin that won't make too much difference. And that's why they're called key performance indicators and not just performance indicators. Underneath that is a whole heap of skills. So telling someone to improve their return on capital by improving a number of KPIs is a bit like telling a football team that they'll win a game if they score more points than the other side. And fundamentally, if a football team gets a heck of a hiding on a weekend and the coach sits them down and he tells them, well, we just didn't score as many points as those guys, so that's why we lost, everyone in that room's not thinking that this guy's a particularly inspirational or intelligent leader. But we will persist with telling farmers to improve return on capital by returning KPIs. If a coach of a team has had a flogging and he's then got to go and front the press, does he sit down when they say, how come you think you lost today, and say, I think it was all our sexy moves that let us down? And this week we'll be practicing sexy moves in an effort to win next week. Is that normally what they say? What do they say? This week we will probably go back to basics. Yep. So you've got to go to the basics of the business, which are the KPI and the skills associated with that. So that's catching the ball, kicking the ball, getting rid of it before someone tackles you. Okay, I want to run a quick awareness test. I would like you to count the number of passes the team in white makes. How many? 13? Who got 13? Who saw the moonwalking bear? Who's seen it before? Okay. So I'm a sceptic, so I rewound it all the way back to the start the first time, and the moonwalking bear is there the first time. And here he comes this time. So the point I'm trying to make is it's incredibly difficult to see what you're not looking for, and it is obvious to me that most farmers actually don't actively look for profit. So there's a real desire, overwhelming desire to farm the way they want to farm, and that's why I think we call it agriculture. The cultural part is kind of a ticket to do what I want because I'm my own boss. But generally what that means is it will compromise profit because we've got hobbies in the business, and hobbies are great, but generally we earn a profit and then we spend it on our hobby. We don't develop a hobby and then hope someone will pay us to do it. If that's the case, then your business strategy, the only strategy you got left is to actually hope for profit. So that's hoping for a great yield, hoping for a high price, hoping for a great season, all those sorts of things. What I've also noticed that as price increases, so those bumper years, bumper and high prices, is that people rapidly gravitate towards doing what they want to do and getting all the shiny things that they love into the business. That'll compromise short-term profit, which it's not a big issue because generally there's a bit of cash hanging around, but it does introduce sticky costs into the business, which are an issue. So I don't know what it's like in the Dubbo area, but certainly in Tasmania, if you buy a header or something like that and then the price crashes and the season crashes the following year, the first person at the door is not the banker saying, take a year off paying your interest-free payments. So those costs are in the business for the long term. So we need to be sure that we can sustain them at average price and average yield. The other thing is that people are really good at working backwards from what they're already going to do with these unbelievably logical arguments around illogical activities. So I'll say, and I've sat and listened to 100 of them. If you're in any farmer type groups, you'll have heard lots of them. And there's a point about the 8-minute mark where you have to stop listening because between minute 8 and minute 10, you will become a believer. So you have to turn off and walk away at that point. I want to just put up some data here from the dairy industry, and it's the same in beef, sheep, and I'm sure cereals. The green line is milk price, and the red line is cost of production. And you can see that as price trends up or it jumps up, we'll get an increase in costs. So you could argue, if you're an economist, that marginal revenue's gone up, marginal costs should go up, and we should chase a little harder. I'll prove to you in a little while that that's not what's happening there. The interesting thing is if that was happening at the margin, when price fell, we'd be able to get those costs back out of the system as quick as they went in, because they're only dribbling in at the margin. We can see that we get these lags and we can't get them out of the system quick enough. The other interesting thing is cost of production is not where costs end, so we've still got to pay interest. The average level of gearing in the Tasmanian dairy industry is around 40 to 50%, so that adds another 70 cents to $1 on top of the red line. So you can see pretty much every year that our break-even price will sit above milk price. And we'll get 1 year in 20, when experienced as they are at getting rid of everything they get, even a Tasmanian dairy farmer has to have some money left over. The interesting part about all of that is, why aren't they all going broke? Why aren't there for sale signs everywhere? Why isn't the dairy industry hemorrhaging? There's a simple model that you can use to operate in that environment, and it just revolves around the manager or the manager's farmer, each person in that business doing the work of 2 people and then leaving both those salaries in the business. And you can carry on forever or until you have a heart attack. Here's some data here. It's just 2 years data, 06, 07, 07, 08. And it's for the average with a star, or bottom 90%, and the top 10%. In that year, 06, 07, we had a milk price of about $4.40, which is a reasonable price. At that time, we weren't saying that it was bad or anything. It was just a reasonable price. And you can tell it was reasonable because the average with a star did a return on capital of 5%. So you probably think it's more of a good price because normally they would do 1 to 1.5% return on capital. In that same year, the top 10% did a return on capital of 12%. How do they do it? The same way they do it across all areas of primary production. They'll generally do more total production, more production per hectare, more production per unit, so say per cow, They'll always throw more inputs at the system to do it than the average. So in this case, I just picked out 2, nitrogen application per hectare, 144 versus 192. Grain fed per cow, 800 kilos on average, 1,100 kilos for the top producers. The dynamic of the business, which remember Saul was talking about the cost of capital, and a number of people came up with that, is the land base. So the more you can harvest per hectare, the cheaper it is. These guys will harvest 20 to 30% more. That's the dynamic in their business. That line alone is pretty much what drives that one. If we go over to 2007 and 8, we had an increase of $2 per kilo. So that's like $100 a tonne increase in grain price. It's massive. Return on capital for the average went up to 8%, top 10%, 16%. The average did just 10% more milk solid production, but threw 50% more nitrogen per hectare at the farm and fed the cows 50% more grain and did no more pasture harvest. They did no more pasture harvest because they literally can't. That's a capacity issue there. They don't know how to eat more grass. The top guys went up 24% in milk solid production, only threw 21% more nitrogen, 10% more grain, and ate 10% more feed, more pasture. And that's how they drove that. Now, that's interesting, particularly if you're a farm business economist, but it's not as interesting as this. If the average with a star did nothing different in 2007 and 8, as opposed to 607, just put the additional $2 a kilo into their pocket, they would have done a 10.5% return on capital. They did an 8% return on capital. So message there is, if you're no good at what you do in terms of business management, you get the opportunity to be much more involved with your business, much more intimate with your business, then you need to resist the urge to do that. And I always put these lower level managers, always to me look like the kid at school who was on the reserve bench, and you just knew the more time he was on the field, the worse you were going to go. And it's the same principle there. Interestingly, the same thing happened in 12-13 and 13-14, where we went from a $5 milk price to a $7 milk price. 4.6 return. They actually did 9.9% return. So you can imagine having a whole industry doing 10% return on capital plus. But if they'd have left it in their pocket, they would have nearly done a 20% return on capital. The difference between those numbers, the 10 and the 8, is about $250,000 to $350,000 leaking out of those businesses on an annual basis. So biggest charitable institution in Tasmania is now the Tasmanian dairy farmer. Second point here is an understanding of the resource base. So you will have seen these sorts of numbers which describe the difference between the best and the average. I'm going to have a quick look at comparative analysis here. So always the best have bigger farms. They will generally have more area to crop because they can go out onto more marginal country and still get a return. They'll have higher yields per hectare. They'll throw more inputs at the system, exactly the same as the dairy guys. They'll be much more labour use efficient. If they run animals, they will have higher stocking rates and they will have all of that added up to a much higher return on capital. In fact, the majority of times that return on capital will be around 200 to 500% higher. Okay, so what we've done is run around and tell all the primary producers what the best are doing and to go and do it. So you will have heard messages like, get bigger farms, more fertiliser, more chemical, more nitrogen, more species, better varieties, more use of contractors, and look, because it's all going to pay so well, if you've got to get some debt to do it, then just go do it. And so we've had more debt. We've also had years when there's been a fair bit of cash kicking around in the system, and so in those years, a lot of these things have been implemented into systems. The unfortunate thing is that they are just characteristics of the better farmers. So I could have added on to the end of the list type of dog and done a survey and said, look, all the best farmers have got kelpies. I think everyone needs to go buy a kelpie and you just watch your profit increase. And you would say, you're mad, you're stupid, you're dumb, whether you like kelpies or not. But we present exactly the same type of information in the vain hope that it's going to improve business performance. So it's not the cause of their success. The cause of their success is the how, not the what. So how they bring it all together. And in fact, I can get two data sets 10 years apart in any industry, anywhere in the world, and I will see that what's happened is the industry has followed those trends. It's done exactly what it's been asked to do. So farms are bigger, there's bigger areas to crop, there's a bit of increase in yield, there's certainly heaps more inputs going into the system. We have got, on average, even more labour use efficient, and that's been good because it's saved a lot of businesses. Stocking rate's a really interesting one. I thought you were going to get the shake out of that pointer for me. Stocking rate's an interesting one. The stocking rate there in DSEs per hectare is in brackets and it hasn't moved, so 3.1, 3.3, it's near enough. The number of sheep kicking around per hectare has gone from 3 to nearly 7. So that means there's twice as many sheep running around on farms, a whole heap of inputs coming in to do something with them, and at the end of the day, no more increase in the underlying stocking rate. So you could say that what's actually happening is you've got twice as many animals producing about the same amount of product as you had with less animals. And that happens in every industry. Can you pretend I'm a fertiliser salesman for a minute? If I was, this would be the graph I'd put up in front of you. Return on capital up here, the amount you spend on fertiliser across here, upward sloping graph, with an R squared of 35%, which means about 35% in the variation of that is explained by that. If I was selling fertiliser, that'd do me. It's actually not too bad for a biological system. If I was then the honest broker, salesman, I would say, guess what? I've just pulled the top 10% of guys out to have a look at that relationship for them. There's an 84% correlation between the return on capital and the amount spent on fertiliser. All that means is if a top producer puts on fertiliser, they grow and harvest something as a result of that. If I leave them out of the sample, I get an R squared of 11%, which means no relationship. So that's a completely random approach to fertiliser application. Everyone else just bungs it out and hopes. And we bung it out and hope because that's what the better farmers are doing. I love this one, the get big or get out. We've got to get scale, we've got to get economies of size, all that sort of stuff into the business. For this sample, there was no relationship between size and profit. That's with everyone in the sample. I thought there was two more. But even if you pull the top guys out, there's no relationship between them and size either. So this is a bit like if we made the assumption that we've got a McDonald's, we've stuck it in some pokey town that's off a major highway, someone convinced them to do it. 12 months later, we bring the board together and say, look, this McDonald's is not going so well. We've figured out the reason for that is we're not selling any hamburgers, and the reason we're not selling any hamburgers is because no one's coming to the restaurant. And say there was a board member who put up his hand and said, I think I know the answer, and that's we need to build another one next door. What sort of traction do you reckon he'd get? Not a lot, but how many farmers who are in underperforming businesses will go and buy the place next door in the vain hope that scale or economies of size or whatever is ultimately limiting their business? In fact, in 20 years, I've never ever once walked into a farm and said, biggest limitation here is size, let's go buy some more. The issue underlying all that is if you go to most data sets, what you will find is that the most profitable farms do tend to be a bit bigger. But the reason for that, if you go and talk to those people and you get their data back far enough, is that they were smaller farms that were profitable and then grew. And so they ran a franchise model based on, this is a successful farming system with successful management, now let's make it bigger. Okay, so if you're not in the top 10%, then all you got is hope, and you've got to pray that somewhere between where you stick it in the ground and you run a header through it, that one or a number of those occurs for you to be anywhere near what the top or 10 or 20% do on a year in, year out basis. Third point there is an understanding of business. So that is a marginal cost, marginal revenue graph, and we should operate where the last unit we produce costs about what we get for it. So what it says is that if price goes up, we should produce more. The reverse of that is if price goes down, we should produce less. So I don't know, again, about how things happen on the mainland, but I will guarantee you, as a result of this year's milk price drop in Tasmania, a vast majority of the dairy farmers in Tassie will be running around saying, I have to produce more. Why do they say I've got to produce more? Somebody's just taken something off me. I've got to make up the difference. So I will go around to all my clients and say, just identify bottom 10, 20% of cows, we're going to kick them out of the system. But we're not going to cut their throats. We're actually going to lease them to the other 80% of people who don't know what's going on here. So there'll be a line up at our front gate of people with their hand in the air going, yes, I'd love to lease your cows. They will pay us 10% of the cow's value. If she goes as a 4-year-old, she'll come back as a 4-year-old. She'll be replaced, so no ageing of the capital. So 20% of our cows we're about to lose money on. We've just hived them out to all the smart people, and we're about to make a 10% return on those animals to lift our average return back on the farm for doing less work. Okay, this one's for you, Saul. Economists are incredibly logical people. They will assume as business managers that if we've got a number of options that we'll work from most profitable to least profitable. And there's an obvious difference also between a profitable and unprofitable decision. What's an issue within primary production around the complexity of it is that if you take option number 3, it can stop you from getting back to option number 1. In lots of other small businesses, you make a mistake, you can go back and retake the option. It'll cost you about 1-to-1. To retake an option in primary production will cost you at about 3-to-1. This marginal cost, marginal revenue analysis at the whole of farm level can be quite complex, but if you oversimplify it, you'll get the wrong answer. Now, if you're going to do something anyway, oversimplify it, because it'll take you less time to get where you're going anyway. Okay, riskiness and robustness. So risk is what happens to the business or the environment it's set in. Robustness is how it responds. So I like my clients to have robust businesses. The way we do that is just set up the business in terms of how it looks, put in average price, put in average yield, put in our average cost structure, work out our return to capital, and then drop the price, the milk price, the grain price, land price, beef price, by 20 to 30%. If we've still got a black line after interest, we've got an incredibly robust business. If it's a little bit red and we can strip a few costs, that's a pretty robust business. If we can't do anything to get back to black, then we're pretty exposed. I just want to show you around good season, good price, average prices, how some of these better versus average businesses respond. So obviously at good seasons and good price, very high returns to capital, modest returns to capital, still pretty good at average season and or average price, not so good. And then when we get this poor season and or poor price, we start to get this hemorrhaging setting in. So if I put that graphically, best thing you can do is start in a position of strength. The pain will take longer to kick in. It'll only kick in for a little while, but you will feel pain even in a really good business in a 4-year drought. But your recovery will be very strong and rapid as well. In these businesses, obviously, the pain kicks in quick. You get to a point where you start capitalising losses. If you're capitalising losses of 10%, it only takes 2 or 3 years and you cannot recover, and you'll see it flatline. The only recovery there is actually people falling out of that system. So no one fell out of that sample. Quite a lot of people fell out of that sample over that period. Okay, the fourth bit is understanding the production system, understanding where the money comes from. And we took 25 years of data and shipped it off to America, to smartest man in the world, and said, tell us out of all that where the money comes from. And he came back and he said, 70% of the profit in a primary production business comes from the technical, tactical, feed-based type management. So that's all the agronomic stuff. That's growing a good crop. And that's growing a relatively good crop even in difficult seasons. 40% is around business management. So that's once you've got a good crop and a price, you know, where do you put the money? Where do you prioritise your spending? Where do you prioritise that spending so the business is more robust going forward? 30% is people management. So interestingly, 15 years ago, that number was 5%. It's now 30% and it's growing faster than all the others. So a lot of businesses are hitting ceilings because the manager cannot manage people. And we're very reluctant to step back and put someone else in who can manage people. So a bit like Bill Gates did. And the operational activity, driving the tractor, the header, dagging a sheep, milking a cow, 15% of profit only. So you'll know that they're important tasks and there's downside, but the business assumes that if you're going to call yourself a primary producer, that you can do that stuff. And the business would also probably assume that you could pull a guy out of the pub and probably have to get him by lunchtime, but you could get him out of the pub and training to do some of that stuff within a week or a fortnight. It's pretty much what the business is saying. So one of the other things I want to talk about is this issue of labour use efficiency, because labour use efficiency has been a big gain in all of primary production. And what we're seeing when we go on case study is that a lot of people think that the improvement in labour use efficiency has been a direct result of substituting technology for labour, and it hasn't. Technology being utilised in a team environment gives you a much bigger... I need to get rid of it because you're not listening. When you bring new technologies and new techniques into businesses that have very good team systems in place and are operating and functioning as a team, you get much bigger increases in productivity than trying to substitute technology for labour. The final thing I want to talk about is the high level of skills associated with the key profit drivers. So all that's saying is that it's no use knowing what to do if you can't actually do it, and you need to be able to do it under game day pressure. So you'll know that for a primary production business, won't matter what it is, there are certain periods of the year when the pressure is right on, and they're, you know, critical around sowing date and those sorts of things. And if you can't get motivated and up for the game, you get a hiding year in, year out. So we need to be able to do it under game day pressure. Then you've got issues like drought, where 3 to 4 years of ongoing high level pressure will take their toll on anyone but the elite. And I'll often see very good young farmers crack under that game day pressure. So they need support, like anyone new to a business or a football team or a new town needs support to achieve at that level. So in terms of describing skill, and Gavin put some numbers up there earlier about, you know, 300 repetitions to be moderately competent, 5,000 hours and then 10,000 hours to be really, really high skilled. So today is not a skill development activity. You're not up practicing stuff. This is information and knowledge today. This is skill development. So that's not that guy's first day on the job. He has had a go at practicing that a number of times. He's probably lost a few toenails, but ultimately, with practice, it's amazing what you can do. Now, we need to adopt that approach to skill development in the grains, beef, sheep area as well, and I don't believe we do. We audit a lot of our clients and we audit all of industries. If we audit any industry, we will generally get about 1/3 to 1/2 of the skills coming through that we would say is necessary to run one of those elite businesses giving high levels of return. Generally, the biggest limitation will be in the key profit driver areas, so only 30 to 40% of the skill required at a business management and technical level year in, year out. And that, for that sample, was the return that was about 1% on capital. If we then take out the top 10% and we audit them, we'll always find that it'll be somewhere between 80 and 100% of the skills necessary. And it will be particularly strong in the technical management, business management areas, but generally these guys confound the whole sample by being good at everything. And if you remember, how long? 5? None. Righto, I'll just leave that anecdote alone then. So those guys did a 6.2% return on capital. There's a very strong link between skill and return on capital, and ultimately that's the difference between a good farmer and a bad farmer. You say, oh, he was lucky, or he or she was 2 weeks early, all that sort of stuff. It's just skill. I want to just go through this quickly. It will only take me 1 minute, but I reckon anywhere you go in the world, love or hate Australians, they will concede that we're a great sporting nation. We can put up the number of gold medals won, the population, and then get an efficiency ratio, which basically says number of medals per million people. You can see that we have a ratio there of 0.35. We win a third of a medal for every million people, and there's no one else in the world that comes close to us. Except them people who, this is another example of the numbers don't always tell you the true story. So you go in behind that, you research it, you find out actually no good at sport, just got very few people to divide by. Reason we're good is because in the 80s we set up institutes of sport. We adopted a professional approach to sport before every other country. At that time, I think we had 12 to 14 individual world champions. 4 years later, we had 60 world champions. So it's clear if you adopt that approach that you can improve with the same resources. We're going to have to innovate now because everyone's got those. This is another one I cut out of the paper, and I've talked a lot about primary producers today, but this is cultural, this desire to blame something other than ourselves. So this said, each year Australian golfers spend $300 million to upgrade their equipment. Every one of those people has a perfectly good set of golf clubs, and they go and buy another set. Over the last 10 years, the average handicap has gone up. So I don't play golf, but I know that means they're getting worse. So the only thing I can conclude out of that is they're now hitting the ball further in the wrong direction. But if I had $1,000 and I said to anyone in this room, you can do two things with it, buy some new golf clubs or get some lessons from a pro, which would have the biggest positive impact on your game? Who plays golf? What are you going to do with the money? Most people will buy golf clubs. So here's another chart. This is return on capital. This is skill development. The bigger the size of the balls there, the longer you've spent in supported learning activities. There's a very clear line between the amount of training or the amount of investment in yourself and the profitability of your business. So there's no doubt your businesses are really complex. They're set in this leaky environment. All that says is it needs very high level of capability and management. Historically, farming systems have come out of the best, the rest trying to copy the best. That means everyone does the right thing, they just do it the wrong way. Successful farming systems should just evolve out of logical business decision making. So what's the next most profitable thing to do on my farm, and go do it. And I think skill is the most important and overlooked aspect of running a successful farm. And the reality is, in farming, primary production, you are actually better to grow the wrong crop well than the right crop poorly. Thanks.